Some women were born wearing crowns that felt more like shackles. Their smiles were rehearsed. Their futures already traded away, long before they learned to speak. Behind velvet doors, obedience was stitched into their childhoods, and silence was the only protection they were allowed to keep. The world praised their elegance, never noticing the cage built into every breath. Tonight you will walk beside them, step by quiet step, through the gilded prison they called a life. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is, where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one stood in a Tudor household and watched a noble daughter being prepared for marriage, the scene would appear orderly, graceful, and almost dignified. Servants adjusted her sleeves. Relatives murmured blessings, and every gesture suggested tradition rather than coercion. Yet beneath the calm movements lay a truth that defined her entire future. She was not being guided toward a life she had chosen, but transferred like property from one authority to another. The ceremony looked gentle, but the mechanism behind it was rigid, cold, and transactional. Among noble families, marriage functioned less as a personal union and more as a calculated exchange. Alliances were weighed, lands evaluated, and lineage measured with the same detachment used in arranging estates. A young woman's preferences mattered little, and her voice even less. What her family prized was her value on the marriage market. How her bloodline, her dowry, and her ability to produce heirs could strengthen political ties. The girl at the center of all this was often treated as a silent detail, present in form but absent in influence. Fathers negotiated with other fathers. Mothers trained their daughters to obey quietly, because obedience itself became part of a woman's worth. Prospective husbands rarely bothered with conversation. They only needed to know that the bride came from a respectable house and could be expected to behave appropriately. The decision, once made, moved quickly. Contracts were written, dowries calculated, and dates set. The young woman's consent was assumed rather than confirmed. Since questioning her willingness would have introduced unnecessary complexity into an arrangement intended to function smoothly, the unsettling part is how normal this appeared to everyone involved. No raised voices, no dramatic scenes, no outward signs of distress. Tradition wrapped itself so tightly around these transactions that even the women living through them often struggled to identify the moment they lost control of their own lives. The calm, ceremonial pace disguised what was essentially a transfer of ownership. Executed politely and publicly, the shift became unmistakable after the wedding. Once married, a noblewoman lost the legal standing she had possessed as a daughter. Her properties, rights, and personal agency moved into her husband's hands with the same finality as land deeds changing ownership. What she wore, where she went, whom she met, and how she behaved were now subject to his approval. Her body fell under his authority as well. Expectation replaced autonomy, and duty replaced desire. Many husbands enforced these expectations not through cruelty, but through routine. Their control was woven into daily life, the supervision of household accounts, the regulation of correspondence, the subtle insistence on silence when decisions were being discussed. Even affectionate marriages operated within this structure, where affection did not cancel the underlying hierarchy. Nobility liked to speak of honor and virtue, yet their domestic order depended on boundaries that kept women obedient and powerless. Children were taught to accept this system long before they could question it. Daughters absorbed the pattern from the way their mothers behaved. Measured, careful, always aware that missteps could harm not only themselves, but their family's reputation. Sens. Meanwhile, I've learned early that their sisters' futures belong to strategy rather than personal choice. In such an environment, emotion became secondary. What mattered was stability, advantage, and the maintenance of status. It is difficult now to imagine the quiet weight carried by those young women who understood what awaited them. They stood in embroidered gowns, praised for their beauty and manners, while knowing that beauty and manners were part of the currency being traded. Some hoped for kindness in their husbands, others resigned themselves to indifference. True partnership, the type built on mutual respect, existed rarely and unpredictably. Most brides entered marriage with the realism of someone stepping into a role that had been written long before their birth. For families, the benefits were tangible. A well-arranged marriage could secure influence, expand estates, or repair financial strain. The bride became a tool in these efforts, simultaneously honored and exploited. To her relatives, she represented opportunity. To her husband, she represented legitimacy. To herself, she often represented nothing more than obligation. Even if she sensed this imbalance, acknowledging it openly was unthinkable. In modern terms, it would resemble signing a contract in which every clause favors the other party, while convincing yourself that the contract is simply tradition. From the outside, the arrangement may appear structured and ceremonial. From the inside, it is binding in ways that silence those most affected. Public rituals reinforced the illusion of celebration. Weddings were lively, filled with music, wine, and the congratulatory voices of guests who admired the union. But the liveliness belonged to the crowd, not to the bride. Her calm expression, often mistaken for modesty, frequently concealed resignation. She had been raised to understand that hesitation reflected poorly on her upbringing. A compliant daughter became a dutiful wife. The transformation was expected to be seamless. After the ceremony, life narrowed. The new wife was expected to manage the household efficiently and obey instructions without dispute. Any deviation, speaking too boldly, requesting independence, or expressing dissatisfaction, could be interpreted as disobedience. These reactions were not only socially discouraged, but could also be punished through isolation, financial restriction, or social humiliation. Male authority defined virtue, and virtue defined a woman's value. What made the system effective was its subtlety. Most women were not physically forced into submission. Instead, they were raised within a structure that made resistance appear impossible and compliance appear honorable. Even when a woman recognized the injustice, she faced it alone, surrounded by people who believed her suffering was simply part of the natural order. Her silence was interpreted as acceptance, and her acceptance became proof that the system worked. The harsh truth is that the moment a noble woman married, she disappeared as an independent individual and re-emerged as an extension of her husband's will. The transformation was quiet, almost graceful, yet absolute. Her life became a reflection of the contract made on her behalf, a contract she neither wrote nor approved. And in every corridor of Tudor society, people called that contract tradition. There is another layer to these unions. Acquieter, 1, where obedience deepens into something far more binding than ceremony. Marriage in Tudor England altered a woman's legal identity with a quiet but absolute force. One moment, she existed as a daughter with certain protections tied to her family name. The next, she stood beneath her husband's authority, her independence erased by law rather than violence. The transformation did not require dramatic gestures. No documents needed to be read aloud. No declarations made. The shift was understood, accepted, and embedded within everyday life. Once married, a noble woman no longer belonged to herself. Under the principle of coverture, a married woman's legal presence became absorbed by her husband's. She could not own property, file a complaint, sign agreements, or make decisions regarding her own finances, her dowry, lands, jewels, clothing. Anything with monetary or symbolic value passed into his control instantly. Even inherited estates, meant to secure her future, effectively strengthened his influence instead. The law insisted this arrangement protected the household, though in reality it protected only the man who ruled it. Observing this from a modern perspective, the absence of the wife's legal identity feels almost surreal. She was present in the home, active in its management, and responsible for countless tasks, yet officially invisible. The law recognized her labor, but not her autonomy. It acknowledged her duties, but not her rights. She lived in a world where every action she took required permission, whether spoken or implied, and where silence became both expectation and survival tactic. Husbands wielded this legal power in ways that varied widely. Some enforced their authority strictly, using the law to monitor their wives' movements, restrict their correspondence, or control their access to funds. Others used the structure more casually, never questioning the legitimacy of a system that favored them completely. Even a husband who treated his wife kindly benefited from an arrangement that denied her the option of making choices separate from his will. Her compliance was not a sign of harmony. It was simply a legal requirement. The lack of legal independence affected more than daily life. It altered how a woman was perceived by society. Her value was defined by her husband's standing, her reputation tethered to his behavior. If he managed his estate poorly, she bore the shame. If he engaged in scandals, she shared the consequences. Yet if she faced harm, financial neglect, or mistreatment, the law offered few avenues for protection. A wife could not sue her husband. She could not claim what was once hers. She could not even guarantee custody of her children. The structure positioned her as an extension of her husband's household, rather than a citizen with personal rights. Failures of the marriage, abuse, abandonment, or exploitation rarely altered this legal reality. A woman who attempted to assert independence was viewed as unruly. Her complaints minimized by the very system designed to silence her. Respectability required her to endure, not resist. Even in extreme cases, her family often urged patience rather than confrontation, fearing the social consequences of challenging a lawful union. The legal framework reinforced obedience at every turn. From the outside, these restrictions were framed as natural. Tudor society believed that unity in marriage required a single guiding authority, and that authority belonged to the husband. The notion that a woman might possess parallel rights was considered disruptive, even dangerous. The law insisted that allowing wives independence would fracture the household, as though stability depended on erasing one person's freedom. Documents of the period reveal the subtle cruelty of this arrangement. Wills that once named daughters as heirs were rewritten to root property through husbands. Contracts listed wives not as participants, but as obligations attached to their spouses. Even items meant for personal use, books, linens, trinkets, became part of the husband's estate. The woman was expected to accept these transitions without question. Her acceptance interpreted as evidence that the system worked. The disappearance of her legal identity had psychological consequences as well. Many wives lived with a quiet awareness that nothing within their reach truly belonged to them. Their rooms, their belongings, their routines could be altered or denied without warning. Dependence shaped their thoughts, their expectations, and the way they navigated the world. Even acts of kindness from a husband underscored the imbalance, reminding them that their comfort depended on someone else's approval. What makes this system particularly stark is the contrast between a woman's visible presence and her invisible rights. She managed estates, raised children, and maintained social ties, all while existing legally as a non-entity. People respected her status, but not her authority, admired her grace, but not her judgment. She lived at the centre of the household, yet remained peripheral in the eyes of the law. This erasure was so deeply rooted that few questioned it. Husbands relied on it. Households assumed it, and women adopted it as part of their identity. The law had shaped behavior, and behavior in turn reinforced the law. In this cycle, a wife's personhood dissolved until only her duties remained. In essence, marriage transformed a noblewoman into property, not through force but through ordinary custom. Her life became a set of obligations framed as virtue, while her rights faded quietly into her husband's shadow. And beyond these boundaries lay an even harsher truth: how easily this legal power could be used to reshape her world without her consent. Parents in Tudor noble families treated marriage not as a personal decision, but as a strategic obligation imposed on their daughters long before those daughters understood what marriage meant. A girl barely past childhood could be told of an engagement arranged on her behalf, the details negotiated without her presence. Her future traded in conversations she never heard. The decision felt less like a milestone and more like a quiet sentence carried out through ceremony rather than force. What she wanted rarely entered the discussion. The age at which these arrangements began exposes the reality of their priorities. Girls, slightly older than 10, were considered suitable for betrothal, and sometimes even younger if the alliance promised significant advantages. Childhood was not seen as a protected phase, but as a period of preparation for usefulness. A daughter's worth lay in how effectively she could serve her family's ambitions, and marriage offered the most efficient means to consolidate influence. Her youth was not a concern, it was an asset, allowing parents and future husbands to shape her into a figure who would not challenge the expectations placed upon her. Parents approached these negotiations with the calm logic of estate planning. They calculated dowries, evaluated political benefits, and examined genealogies with a precision that left little room for sentiment. They viewed daughters as links in long chains of obligation, tools for strengthening bonds with other houses. The girl herself was part of the equation, but her preferences mattered no more than those of a parcel being exchanged. When a match promised social elevation or financial improvement, hesitation was discouraged, and refusal was unthinkable. For the daughter, the announcement of an arranged marriage could feel abrupt, even disorienting. One day, she played among servants or studied needlework. The next, she was told she would soon belong to a man she had never spoken to. Her parents delivered the decision as though it were natural, almost inevitable. This tone of normalcy softened the shock, while simultaneously denying her any sense of choice. She was expected to accept her role with quiet dignity, just as generations before her had done. Attempts to refuse were rare and carried consequences. A girl who resisted risked damaging her family's plans, embarrassing her parents, and undermining the negotiations that shaped noble alliances. Such defiance was interpreted not as a plea for autonomy, but as a flaw in character, a failure in discipline. Families responded by intensifying supervision, invoking religious expectations, or threatening isolation. Obedience was praised as a virtue. Reluctance was treated as disrespect. The pressure was constant, steady enough to suppress resistance before it fully formed. The emotional impact of these arrangements lingered beneath the surface. Many girls experienced a quiet fear, not of the marriage ceremony itself, but of stepping into a life chosen entirely by others. They learned to carry this tension in silence, understanding that expressing discomfort would only reinforce the belief that they were too immature to have opinions. Their internal world, the confusion, the reluctance, the longing for time, was overshadowed by the outward ritual of compliance. Parents justified their control by citing tradition and duty. They insisted that daughters could not understand the implications of marriage, and that allowing them to choose would risk instability or dishonor. These arguments created a framework in which the parents' authority appeared both natural and benevolent. But this benevolence concealed a deeper truth. The marriage served the family first, the daughter second. Her well-being was discussed only in practical terms. Whether the husband was respectable, whether the estates were well managed, and whether the alliance strengthened the family's position. The girl's emotional readiness was seldom considered. Her ability to adapt, to endure, or to build a life with a stranger was assumed rather than nurtured. She was expected to grow into the marriage, as one grows into a garment chosen by someone else. Perhaps too heavy, perhaps uncomfortable, but still worn without complaint. Even when parents showed affection, their affection operated within a system that prioritized obligation over individuality. These arranged unions reflected a broader societal structure in which daughters were raised to anticipate a predetermined path. Their upbringing reinforced obedience, modesty, and the importance of serving their family's reputation. By the time the marriage decision arrived, most girls lacked the tools or the permission to imagine alternatives. Their future had been mapped out long before they could question it. The most striking aspect of this system is how ordinary it appeared to everyone involved. Parents saw themselves not as enforcers but as caretakers. Daughters saw themselves not as victims but as participants in a tradition too large to challenge. The absence of choice was woven so tightly into daily life that many accepted it without recognizing the loss embedded in that acceptance. In these households, marriage was less a personal journey and more a calculated extension of family strategy. The daughter's compliance was treated as proof that the system functioned smoothly, even when her silence concealed unspoken fears. Beyond the threshold of each arranged union waited expectations capable of reshaping her life in ways she could not yet see. Marriage in Tudor, noble society often began long before the bride understood what marriage even meant. Engagements were arranged for girls who had not yet reached puberty. Their futures assigned with the same calm certainty used in planning estates or negotiating land boundaries. Childhood did not shield them from adult expectations. Instead, it served as the perfect stage for shaping obedience. A girl who was too young to challenge decisions posed no threat to the ambitions of her family or the desires of the man who would eventually claim her. Families considered early betrothals as a prudent strategy rather than premature interference. The younger the girl, the easier it was to mold her into a compliant wife who would not disrupt alliances or question authority. Her immaturity was treated as an advantage. She could be taught to admire a husband she had never chosen, to suppress opinions she had never been encouraged to form, and to measure her value through the expectations imposed on her. Age, in this system, was not a measure of readiness, but a tool of control. The stark age gap between the bride and groom reinforced this imbalance. Husbands were often decades older, sometimes widowers with established households and political responsibilities. They entered marriage with experience, authority, and financial power, while the girl entered with little more than instruction on how to behave. The disparity created a relationship defined not by partnership, but by hierarchy. The man possessed knowledge, property, and social weight. The girl possessed none of these, and the structure ensured she would not gain them. From the perspective of the families involved, such matches made practical sense. A seasoned man offered stability, influence, and the promise of advantageous alliances. Whether he was twice the girl's age or older barely registered as a concern. His prior marriages, his children, even his reputation, were secondary to the benefits he could provide. What mattered was not compatibility but opportunity. Affection was never part of the equation. The emotional reality for these young brides was often quiet and unspoken. They stepped into marriages with only a vague understanding of the role they were expected to fulfill. Their lack of psychological maturity was treated as irrelevant, dismissed as an inconvenience that would resolve itself with time. Adults around them assumed that their innocence would naturally give way to conformity, as though obedience required no more than patience and instruction. The responsibilities thrust upon them, however, were far from simple. They were expected to manage households, navigate social expectations, and prepare for the demands of childbearing, all while still at an age when they might otherwise have been learning basic courtly skills or playing within the walls of their family home. The transformation from girl to wife was abrupt, presented as tradition rather than transition, leaving little space for emotional adjustment. In many cases, the young bride's first encounters with her husband underscored the imbalance. Meeting a man much older, often with children near her age, could be unsettling. Yet she was expected to interact with calm respect, to demonstrate willingness, and to show gratitude for a match deemed beneficial. The older husband, accustomed to authority, rarely questioned the fairness of the arrangement. Society validated his position, reinforcing the belief that his experience justified his dominance. Observers sometimes praised these unions for their practicality, citing the stability they produced within noble circles. But beneath the surface lay a quieter truth. The girl's life path had been fixed long before she had the capacity to imagine alternatives. Her own development, emotional, intellectual, or social, was secondary to the priorities of lineage. Growing up became something she did within the confines of marriage rather than before it. Some girls adjusted over time, adopting the expectations placed upon them with a sense of inevitability. Others lived with a persistent unease they could not voice, aware that the world around them had decided their worth before they could define it for themselves. Their internal conflicts remained hidden beneath layers of etiquette, modesty, and duty. Even when they felt the weight of their situation, they lacked the vocabulary or permission to articulate it. Parents rarely acknowledged the potential harm in arranging marriages at such young ages. They believed they were acting responsibly, securing their daughter's future by aligning her with a powerful name. They spoke of duty, legacy, and opportunity, avoiding the uncomfortable truth that their decisions often stripped their daughters of agency long before adulthood. What they interpreted as foresight was, for the girl, a quiet erasure of choice. The social structure upheld this pattern with remarkable consistency. Girls were praised for accepting their fate, while those who hesitated risked being labelled troublesome or ungrateful. The pressure to conform was subtle but constant, shaping their identities before they had time to form independent desires. Marriage, rather than a milestone of maturity, became a predetermined destination that absorbed the final fragments of childhood. In such unions, the question of readiness was never directed at the bride. Readiness was assumed simply because the arrangement benefited others. Her youth functioned as a tool for the ambitions of her family, allowing them to bind alliances without facing resistance. And behind this facade of order waited a deeper cost, one that would emerge as she grew into a life she never chose. Marriage in Tudor England bound a woman with a permanence that felt less like devotion and more like captivity. Once the vows were spoken, the union became nearly impossible to dissolve, no matter how destructive or loveless it proved to be. The phrase, "till death do us part," spoken so softly during ceremonies, carried a weight far heavier than sentiment. It served as a reminder that a wife's exit from marriage was not a matter of choice, but of fate, sanctioned only by a monarch whose attention rarely turned toward the suffering of noble women. For most wives, seeking dissolution was unthinkable. The legal system did not recognize their independence, and the church offered no sympathy for discontent. Marriages were designed to serve dynastic stability rather than individual well-being. A woman who wished to leave her husband confronted a wall of resistance. Priests who insisted endurance was holy, relatives who feared scandal, and a husband who held complete authority over her daily existence. Even the notion of separation felt dangerous, as though imagining freedom itself was an act of defiance. At the heart of this confinement was the fact that only the king could approve annulments. His political calculations, not personal suffering, determined whether a marriage could end. Requests from noble households were rare, and successful ones even rarer. A woman trapped in a violent or neglectful marriage could wait years without receiving an answer, her petitions ignored or dismissed. The crown valued alliances more than the safety of individual wives. To break a union was to destabilize agreements woven into the fabric of noble society. Abuse inside these marriages often remained invisible, not because it was mild, but because it was accepted. A husband who shouted, struck, or humiliated his wife was considered harsh, perhaps regrettable, but still within his rights. Domestic cruelty did not violate social norms, it blended into them. Even neglect could stretch on indefinitely, leaving the wife isolated within her own home, pressured to maintain appearances lest her suffering tarnish the family's reputation. The expectations placed upon her ensured silence. Neighbours noticed bruises or whispered rumours, yet they rarely intervened. A wife was expected to endure her circumstances with composure, and her endurance was framed as virtue rather than tragedy. Outsiders viewed her pain through the lens of inevitability. If she had chosen, or rather, been given, a husband of poor temperament, that outcome was interpreted as unfortunate but final. The responsibility to persevere lay solely on her, while the husband's actions were dismissed as personal flaws that did not threaten the structure of marriage itself. Even women of high rank faced the same constraints. Nobility offered wealth, status, and visibility, but no protection from marital violence or neglect. A duchess or countess might hold influence in courtly settings, yet she remained subject to her husband's authority at home. Her jewels and fine gowns concealed the same vulnerability endured by lesser noblewomen. Position did not grant freedom, it simply raised the social cost of admitting misery. Emotional suffering compounded the physical dangers. A wife living in fear learned to predict her husband's moods, adjusting her voice, her posture, and even her breathing to avoid provoking him. She carried this vigilance into every hour of the day, shaping her identity around the desire to survive without drawing attention to her distress. Her world shrank until all that remained was duty, caution, and the quiet hope that her endurance might one day soften the brutality surrounding her. In rare cases, a woman attempted to flee. These efforts almost always failed. Without legal independence, she could not claim her own property or secure her children. The law viewed her departure as abandonment, a moral failure that justified her husband's grievances. She might be dragged back, publicly shamed, or cut off from her family. Those who sympathized with her seldom acted, fearing that involvement would entangle them in scandal or royal displeasure. Escape became less a solution and more a desperate dream. The permanence of marriage also shaped how society interpreted a woman's suffering. If she remained with her husband, people praised her loyalty. If she expressed fear or frustration, they labeled her ungrateful. If she hoped for freedom, they accused her of rebellion. Every possible reaction reinforced the same message. Her discomfort was a private matter, irrelevant to the political and social machinery that relied on stable unions. It is striking how thoroughly death became the only acceptable endpoint. A woman could live decades with a man who harmed or despised her, and society would still call the bond sacred. Only illness, misfortune, or old age could release her. And even then, the relief was often accompanied by new uncertainties. Inheritance disputes, family pressures, or forced remarriage to serve yet another alliance. Stability, in this system, demanded her silence until her final breath. Within these marriages, commitment functioned as a boundary rather than a promise, locking women into lives dictated by others' ambitions. Their endurance was praised publicly, even when it concealed private harm that no one wished to confront. Somewhere within that quiet endurance lay a truth more unsettling than the vows themselves. Freedom was never part of the design. Dowries, in Tudor noble society, were presented as gifts, generous offerings from a bride's family meant to secure her future. Yet beneath the polite language surrounding them, dowries functioned less as safeguards and more as calculated investments, designed to strengthen alliances while binding the woman to expectations she could not escape. Once the payment was made, it shaped every aspect of her marriage, from how she was treated to how much she was allowed to endure. A substantial dowry increased a woman's desirability, but it also intensified the pressure placed upon her. Families viewed the payment as proof of commitment to the union, while husbands interpreted it as justification for full authority. The larger the dowry, the more compliant the bride was expected to be. Her silence, her obedience, and her willingness to submit were seen as natural extensions of the financial exchange. In this system, wealth offered her no leverage. It only heightened the standard she was required to meet. Husbands who married for dowry often approached the union with the detachment of someone acquiring property. The money, land, or goods transferred upon marriage became his instantly, strengthening his estate while stripping the wife of any financial independence she once held. Whatever sentimental value the family placed on the items meant little once they crossed the threshold. Gifts became assets. Assets became leverage, and leverage settled firmly into the husband's hands. When conflicts arose within the marriage, the dowry influenced nearly every response. A wife who complained about mistreatment risked being reminded, directly or indirectly, of the payment that had accompanied her. Some husbands framed her suffering as a burden, one that justified their claim to her loyalty. Others viewed her distress as irrelevant, believing the financial transaction had already compensated for any inconvenience. The bride's well-being was treated as secondary to the profit her marriage had secured. In theory, dowries were supposed to offer protection. Families believed that providing a generous sum would ensure their daughter's comfort and security. In practice, the opposite often occurred. The payment reduced the bride to a commodity, valued for what she brought rather than who she was. Husbands who saw their wives through the lens of financial gain tended to view disobedience as wasteful, ingratitude as offensive, and independence as a threat to the investment made on their behalf. If the marriage deteriorated, recovering the dowry was nearly impossible. Families who sought its return faced legal obstacles, social stigma, and the resistance of husbands who felt entitled to retain the payment regardless of their behavior. In many cases, the husband's mismanagement or cruelty had no bearing on the issue. The bride's family had no authority to reclaim what they had given. The financial loss alone discouraged parents from supporting their daughter in moments of crisis. A broken marriage meant humiliation, expense, and the appearance of poor judgment. This financial trap extended deeply into the woman's daily life. She might wake each morning aware that her comfort, reputation, and stability were tied to a payment she did not control. If her husband treated her unkindly, she could not threaten departure without destabilizing her family's interests. If he neglected her, she could not appeal for separation without risking public shame. The dowry, intended to secure her future, instead anchored her to a marriage that demanded endurance rather than contentment. The psychological impact of this arrangement was subtle but constant. A wife learned to measure her words carefully, to present herself in ways that justified the investment behind her, and to avoid any behavior that might be interpreted as disrespect. She lived in the shadow of the financial transaction that defined her place within the household, aware that her value had been quantified long before her marriage began. Even acts of kindness from her husband were filtered through this awareness. Affection could change, but the dowry remained, shaping expectations regardless of emotion. Families reinforced this dynamic, urging daughters to maintain their unions at all costs. They reminded them of the resources spent, the political ties established, and the consequences of failure. A daughter who wished to leave her marriage risked not only her own reputation, but also the financial and social stability of her relatives. The pressure to remain quiet, obedient, and patient was overwhelming, leaving little room for resistance. Society viewed these arrangements as practical. A well-matched marriage with an impressive dowry elevated families, strengthened alliances, and preserved wealth across generations. Whatever personal cost the bride endured was considered insignificant in comparison to the long-term benefits for the household. Her individual suffering dissolved into the broader narrative of noble responsibility. Yet beneath this polished surface, countless women lived with the quiet understanding that their dowries had trapped them. It had promised protection, but delivered obligation. Promised stability, but created dependence. Promised value, but erased autonomy. The exchange that marked the beginning of their marriage lingered in every expectation placed upon them, binding them as tightly as any legal restriction. Within this system, the dowry functioned less as a blessing, and more as a silent contract dictating her obedience. Her comfort mattered far less than the investment her family had made, and the profit her husband believed he deserved. And at the heart of every gilded promise lay a truth she could not ignore. The price paid for her marriage had purchased her silence. In Tudor, noble society, a woman's body was treated as an extension of lineage rather than an expression of personal autonomy. From the moment she married, the expectation was clear. She was to bear children early, regularly, and without objection. Her value in the household, and often her safety, depended on her ability to produce heirs. This duty overshadowed every aspect of her life, shaping her routines, her relationships, and the way others measured her worth. The pressure did not arrive suddenly. It sank into her world with a quiet certainty, as though it had always been waiting for her. Households viewed childbirth not as an intimate milestone, but as a requirement tied to property, succession, and family pride. A wife might be praised for her grace, intelligence, or skill in managing domestic affairs. But none of these qualities mattered as much as her fertility. Her wedding marked the beginning of her reproductive obligations, and each year that passed without a child intensified the scrutiny. She felt it in the glances exchanged between servants, in the questions relatives asked too casually, in the way her husband's patience thinned as months turned into seasons. The expectation of frequent pregnancies left little room for recovery or rest. Women endured cycles of childbirth, miscarriage, and frailty, while still expected to fulfill their daily responsibilities. The strain on their bodies was immense. Yet society framed their suffering as natural, even admirable. The ideal noblewoman endured pain silently, delivering child after child without complaint. A wife who struggled physically or emotionally was seen not as a victim of impossible demands, but as someone failing in her fundamental role. When pregnancies ended in miscarriage, or when a woman could not conceive, blame fell upon her with ruthless consistency. Tudor medicine lacked the knowledge to identify the many male factors that cause infertility. Yet men were seldom questioned. A husband's failures were hidden by pride. But a wife's inability to produce heirs was treated as evidence of weakness, sin, or divine displeasure. Whispers spread through households long before accusations were spoken aloud. Even women who had no control over their circumstances found themselves judged as though they had failed deliberately. The emotional burden of this blame was profound. A woman who miscarried was expected to grieve quietly and resume her duties without lingering sadness. Public displays of despair were discouraged, as though sorrow itself risked damaging her reputation. The world around her offered sympathy only in measured amounts, careful not to appear indulgent. Illness, exhaustion, and fear accumulated within her, forming a private world of uncertainty that no one acknowledged unless it interfered with her obligations. Her suffering remained invisible because the system depended on maintaining the illusion that her role was straightforward. The legal expectations surrounding marital intimacy further deepened her vulnerability. A husband's right to claim his wife's body was unquestioned. Consent was not part of the social vocabulary. Sexual coercion within marriage was not recognized as a violation, for the law positioned the wife as an extension of her husband's will. Her discomfort, fear, or pain did not diminish his entitlement. In the eyes of society, fulfilling his desires was simply another aspect of her duty, no different from managing household affairs or maintaining social decorum. This dynamic created a sense of confinement that extended beyond the physical. A wife learned to anticipate her husband's needs, to respond without hesitation, and to suppress any instinct for self-preservation that might disrupt expectations. Her body became a site of obligation, shaped by the demands of a system that valued her productivity more than her personhood. The absence of legal protection meant there was no boundary she could enforce, no safeguard that recognized her humanity apart from her reproductive function. Men, insulated by authority, rarely questioned these arrangements. Even those who felt affection for their wives operated within a framework that normalized imbalance. They saw themselves as fulfilling tradition rather than imposing harm. Society validated their dominance, reinforcing the belief that control over their wives' bodies was both natural and necessary. Affection could soften the dynamic, but could not correct the structural inequality that defined it. Over time, the repeated cycle of expectation, pregnancy, and blame shaped a woman's understanding of herself. Her identity narrowed to a single question: whether she could give her husband a child. Every symptom, every delay, every whispered comment reminded her that her place in the household depended on forces she could not fully command. Even when she succeeded, the relief was temporary. Another pregnancy would be expected, another risk endured, another judgment prepared. The most unsettling part of this system was its quiet consistency. No dramatic punishments were needed to enforce compliance. The weight of expectation, woven through family pressure, legal authority, and social norms, was enough to ensure obedience. A woman who resisted these demands stood alone, without legal recognition or community support. Her silence became a survival tactic, a fragile barrier between herself and a world that valued her only as long as she produced heirs. Within this structure, a wife's body belonged not to herself, but to the ambitions of those around her. Her suffering blended into routine, unnoticed, because the system relied on her compliance to function. Behind closed doors, however, each demand carved deeper into the life she might have lived, had choice been part of her story. Surveillance within Tudor noble households did not announce itself through dramatic gestures. It settled into a woman's life quietly, woven into the structure of marriage so thoroughly that many struggled to pinpoint the moment privacy ceased to exist. A wife lived under constant observation, her actions monitored not only by her husband, but by the servants who answered to him. The scrutiny appeared ordinary, even protective. Yet its purpose was unmistakable: to ensure she remained obedient and predictable, bound tightly to the expectations imposed upon her. The oversight often began with her daily movements. A husband might insist on knowing where she spent her time, whom she spoke to, and why she lingered in certain rooms. These questions were framed as concern, but the repetition revealed their true function. A noblewoman could not wander freely through her own estate without being noticed. Servants reported her habits, intentionally or not, through the simple act of carrying out their duties in her presence. A glance exchanged between them, a pause at the doorway, or a lingering footstep on the staircase served as reminders that she was never alone. Letters offered no refuge. Correspondence, which could have connected her to friends or family, became another point of control. Husbands or stewards inspected the messages she wrote and received, screening for inappropriate sentiments or any hint of dissatisfaction. A letter that seemed too emotional could be questioned. One written too often might be withheld entirely. Women learned to write cautiously, trimming their words until communication resembled polite formality rather than genuine expression. The act of reaching for ink and parchment began to feel like trespassing into a private world she was no longer allowed to inhabit. Travel restrictions deepened the isolation. Leaving the estate required permission, often accompanied by chaperones who reported her behavior. Visits to relatives, if allowed at all, were brief and supervised. Husbands justified these limitations by citing safety, propriety, or the need to maintain order. But the effect was unmistakable. The wife's world narrowed until it resembled a series of connected rooms, rather than a life with independent direction. Even short walks in the gardens could be monitored. The presence of a maid reinforcing the unspoken expectation that solitude itself was suspicious. Distance from her family of origin reinforced the confinement. Marriage shifted her loyalty from her parents to her husband, and households often enforced this transition aggressively. Visiting her childhood home became rare, limited by travel restrictions, financial considerations, or the husband's reluctance to encourage outside influence. In some cases, letters from her family were delayed or withheld to prevent emotional support that might weaken her compliance. The woman, once surrounded by familiar faces, found herself increasingly dependent on people who viewed her primarily through the lens of obligation. This isolation carried a psychological weight that was easy to overlook from the outside. A noblewoman living under constant supervision learned to regulate her expressions, to speak carefully, and to anticipate the interpretations others might place on her behavior. She became both participant and observer in her own life, monitoring herself as closely as those around her did. The loss of privacy did not simply limit her actions, it reshaped her thoughts, filtering them through a sense of caution that grew heavier with each passing year. Servants, though often sympathetic, were part of the system that contained her. Their livelihoods depended on maintaining the hierarchy, and even the most well-intentioned individuals could not ignore the expectations placed upon them. A maid who noticed distress might offer a quiet gesture of comfort, but she could not challenge the rules or provide real escape. The structure of the household ensured that everyone participated in preserving its balance. Willingly or not, husbands rarely questioned the legitimacy of such control. To them, supervising their wives was not an intrusion, but a responsibility. They believed that order required oversight, that loyalty required vigilance, and that propriety required boundaries. Even men who felt affection for their wives operated within a system that normalized control, convincing themselves that restriction protected honor rather than diminished freedom. The imbalance became self-sustaining, passed from generation to generation without significant challenge. For the wife, the absence of private space created a profound sense of displacement. Moments that might have offered comfort, writing in solitude, speaking candidly with a sibling, or walking beyond the estate, became luxuries denied to her. She carried her isolation with a quiet endurance that few noticed, masking her discomfort to avoid accusations of ingratitude or rebellion. Her life unfolded inside a framework that permitted no distance between her and those who monitored her, leaving her vulnerable in ways that remained unseen but deeply felt. The most striking aspect of this constant surveillance was how seamlessly it blended into the rhythms of daily life. Over time, the lack of privacy became normal, the presence of observers expected, and the feeling of confinement familiar. A woman might recognize her isolation, but lack the language or permission to name it, trapped in a silence that reinforced the very structure containing her. In such an environment, isolation functioned as a quiet method of control, shaping her behavior long before resistance could form. Her world shrank to the size of what others allowed her to see, while her thoughts remained guarded even in her own mind. Somewhere within that shrinking space, the boundaries tightened further, preparing to dictate not only where she could go, but who she could become. Inheritance in Tudor, noble society, functioned through a structure that excluded women with quiet certainty. Titles passed to sons. Estates followed the male line. And the wife, who had lived within the household, upheld its reputation and carried its burdens, was treated as a temporary presence rather than a rightful heir. Her position existed only through her husband's favour. Once that favour disappeared, whether through neglect or death, the foundation beneath her life could collapse instantly. From the moment she married, a woman understood that her identity became secondary to the lineage she served. She might belong to a prestigious family by birth, yet her status as a wife did not elevate her to permanence. Instead, she became a conduit through which titles could be secured, heirs produced, and alliances strengthened. Society praised her grace and loyalty, but those qualities held no legal weight. Her contribution to the household, no matter how significant, was never enough to guarantee her future. The title her husband carried shaped her daily existence, but it did not belong to her. She could host gatherings, oversee servants, and manage estates on his behalf. Yet the law recognized her authority only as an extension of his. Should he withdraw his affection or trust, her influence evaporated. The instability was subtle but constant. A minor shift in her husband's mood, a rumor whispered in court, or a political dispute could redefine her standing overnight. Her security rested not on law, but on a man's willingness to uphold it. This dependency grew more precarious with age. As years passed, a wife watched her children, especially her sons, become the focal point of the inheritance system. They were celebrated as the future of the family, the rightful continuators of the name. She, meanwhile, drifted toward the margins, respected publicly, but increasingly irrelevant in private matters. Even in households where affection existed, the legal framework ensured she remained a spectator in decisions that shaped the legacy she helped sustain. The true extent of her vulnerability often revealed itself only when her husband died. In the period of mourning, she might appear central, draped in black, surrounded by attendants, spoken to with solemn courtesy. But beneath these rituals lay the reality that her position had already begun to unravel. The title she once shared symbolically now transferred to her son, a male relative, or another heir designated long before her grief had settled. Decisions about the estate, finance, and household authority shifted immediately. Sometimes without her consultation, widows frequently found themselves displaced, stripped not only of influence, but of physical space. The home in which they had raised children, managed affairs, and navigated countless obligations might no longer be theirs to inhabit. Some were allowed to remain temporarily, granted rooms out of courtesy. But these gestures were fragile and subject to change. Others were asked to relocate to smaller residences or sent to live with relatives, maintaining the appearance of dignity while losing everything familiar. Financial instability compounded the emotional loss, without control over inheritance. Widows often relied on allowances determined by the new heir. These allowances could be generous or restrictive, steady or unpredictable. A son sympathetic to his mother's needs might ensure her comfort, a son influenced by advisors, or shaped by resentment, might reduce her provisions to assert control. The widow's survival hinged on relationships rather than rights, leaving her exposed to dynamics that shifted with time and temperament. The social interpretation of her role reinforced this dependency. A widow was expected to embody quiet dignity, avoiding confrontation and accepting the new order with grace. Any attempt to claim authority risked being labelled as impropriety. Her grief did not protect her. Her experience did not empower her. She occupied a liminal space, honoured yet powerless, present yet peripheral. The contrast between the respect given to her publicly and the lack of security offered privately created a dissonance that many endured silently. Women understood the boundaries placed upon them, but had little means to challenge them. Stories circulated of widows who fought for property or attempted to defend their position. But these tales often ended with their efforts dismissed or punished. The legal system favoured continuity through male heirs, and society viewed attempts to disrupt that order with suspicion, even when injustice was clear. Custom outweighed fairness. Tradition, not equity, defined inheritance. Despite these constraints, noble women carried the burden of preserving a family's legacy. They nurtured children, upheld lineage, and managed households, yet remained excluded from the very system their labour sustained. Their contributions disappeared into the background, overshadowed by a structure that valued their presence but denied their permanence. They existed within noble histories as figures of elegance, devotion, and resilience, never as rightful inheritors of the world they helped build. Within this hierarchy, titles and estates moved seamlessly from man to man, leaving the woman who sustained them with little more than ceremonial acknowledgement. Her standing rose and fell with the whims, loyalties, and mortality of others, offering no foundation she could claim as her own. Beneath the grandeur of inheritance lay a silence that exposed its cost, the erasure of the very person who held the household together. High rank in Tudor England offered spectacle, ceremony, and the illusion of safety, but it did little to protect a woman from the unpredictable reach of royal power. A duchess, a countess, even a queen could find her fate shifting overnight. Her life balanced precariously on the temper of a king whose displeasure carried lethal consequences. Titles elevated her in the eyes of the court, yet the same titles made her more vulnerable than the women hidden behind estate walls. The higher she stood, the sharper the fall became. The royal court was a place of glittering surfaces layered over quiet fear. Every gesture, every remark, every moment of attention had the potential to alter a noblewoman's future. A queen might preside over ceremonies with dignified calm, yet beneath her composed appearance lay an awareness that her position depended entirely on the king's satisfaction. No matter how carefully she navigated court life, her influence could evaporate without warning. The throne offered visibility, not security. Anne Boleyn understood this better than most. Elevated from lady-in-waiting to queen, she embodied the precarious blend of admiration and resentment that followed women who gained influence through royal affection. Political tensions, religious upheaval, and personal grievances converged around her, transforming once celebrated qualities into accusations. Admirers became critics, allies became witnesses. Her downfall unfolded publicly, yet its origins lay in private frustrations and shifting ambitions. The same court that praised her wit and elegance later scrutinized her every movement as evidence against her. The charges brought against her illustrated the fragility of high status. Adultery, treason, and witchcraft. Accusations impossible to defend against, in an environment where suspicion held more weight than truth. She faced her trial with composure, yet the outcome had been determined long before she entered the hall. Her title did not shield her. Instead, it amplified the spectacle of her collapse, turning her execution into a political statement disguised as justice. Catherine Howard's fate followed a similarly chilling pattern. Young, inexperienced, and placed in a position she was never prepared to navigate, she became entangled in expectations she could not meet. The court interpreted her behaviour through a lens sharpened by fear and hypocrisy. Her past became grounds for condemnation, and her youth offered no leniency. The label of improper conduct carried enough weight to seal her death, revealing how little distinction existed between error and crime for women bound to a king's favour. Her beauty, once admired, turned into evidence against her. Her charm, once celebrated, became a liability. These stories were not anomalies but reflections of a system in which noble women existed within strict boundaries. Their lives were shaped by politics they did not control, loyalties they could not predict, and alliances formed in rooms they were not permitted to enter. Even the most privileged women learned that power acquired through proximity to the throne was unstable, conditioned on maintaining favor in a world that demanded perfection and punished deviation. Courtly appearances intensified the illusion of security. A queen surrounded by attendants, jewels, and ceremony seemed untouchable. Yet each symbol of wealth concealed an underlying truth. Her survival depended on maintaining the king's trust. A whisper of infidelity, a misinterpreted glance, or an accusation from a rival could dismantle everything she had built. Her crown was a fragile ornament, easily removed when political necessity demanded it. The expectations placed upon noble women amplified their vulnerability. They were meant to inspire admiration without provoking suspicion, to command attention without displaying ambition, and to embody virtue without exposing weakness. Any misstep could be recast as betrayal, any personal connection viewed as conspiracy. Male courtiers maneuvered strategically, but women faced scrutiny so intense that normal human behavior, friendship, kindness, and sorrow could be weaponized against them. Living under these conditions shaped a woman's inner world. She learned to measure her expressions, to silence her opinions, and to accept uncertainty as part of her daily existence. A queen might smile during court festivities, knowing that her life rested on forces beyond her control. A duchess might host lavish gatherings while fearing the consequences of a rumor she had not yet heard. Their dignity masked the anxiety woven into their positions. Even outside the royal family, noble women witnessed these tragedies with uneasy awareness. They understood that if queens could fall so swiftly, then their own protections were even more fragile. The spectacle of executions, public, deliberate, and final, served as reminders of how thin the boundary was between honor and disgrace. The axe did not distinguish between titles. It responded only to royal command. At the core of this instability lay the absolute authority of the king. His approval defined success. His anger defined danger. No rank could counterbalance his judgment, and no virtue could erase the consequences of losing his trust. A woman might live with grace, intelligence, and loyalty, yet still become a casualty of political conflict or personal displeasure. Survival depended less on character than on circumstance. The grandeur of noble titles masked a truth that few dared speak aloud. Privilege offered exposure, not protection. Even the most powerful women remained vulnerable to sudden shifts in royal favor. Their fate intertwined with a system that valued their position more than their existence. Within this hierarchy, rank only magnified the dangers that shadowed noble women, binding them to expectations they could never fully control. Their titles shimmered in public light while offering little refuge from the forces that governed their survival. Behind the splendor of courtly life waited consequences capable of extinguishing their influence and their lives. With unsettling ease, accusations of infidelity in Tudor England revealed a divide so stark that it shaped every aspect of a noblewoman's existence. A husband could maintain mistresses openly, his behavior tolerated as a natural extension of male privilege. Yet a wife lived under a level of scrutiny so intense that a single misinterpreted gesture could destroy her life. This imbalance did not surprise those who lived within it. Its logic was embedded deeply into the culture. Yet its consequences remained devastating. A woman's virtue was treated as public property, her fidelity as political as it was personal, and her survival often depended on how convincingly she could inhabit the role others demanded. The double standard began within the household. A nobleman's affairs were dismissed as diversions, spoken of with indulgent amusement among male peers. Rumours of his indiscretions circulated through servants' quarters and court gatherings. Yet these stories rarely damaged his reputation. They were treated as proofs of virility, not failures of loyalty. Wives learned quickly that confronting such behavior invited danger rather than sympathy. To voice objection risked being labelled jealous or rebellious, traits that could be twisted into accusations of disobedience. A wife, however, existed in an entirely different framework. Her body symbolized lineage, legitimacy, and political alliances. Any suspicion cast upon her threatened the stability of the household. For this reason, even vague hints of impropriety could escalate rapidly. A moment of laughter with a courtier, an unguarded glance across a hall, or a poorly timed letter could be interpreted as evidence of betrayal. Servants who witnessed her daily movements, those same individuals who ignored the husband's indiscretions, might report her behavior with heightened vigilance, their observations colored by the belief that a woman's virtue required constant guarding. The severity of punishment stemmed from the belief that female infidelity jeopardized bloodlines. A man's affair produced no threat to inheritance, but a woman's could cast doubt on paternity. Thus, the law responded with ferocity. Wives accused of adultery risked imprisonment, public disgrace, or execution. Trials often lacked fairness. Accusations alone carried substantial weight. The court interpreted silence as guilt, composure as deceit, and distress as proof of moral failure. A woman living under these conditions controlled her expressions carefully, knowing that even innocence required performance. Noble women learned to inhabit stillness as a form of survival. They moderated their steps, their voice, the tilt of their head when speaking to male courtiers. Conversations were kept brief, gestures minimal, emotions restrained. The vigilance became internalized. She monitored her own movements as though observing herself through the eyes of the household. The boundaries felt invisible yet absolute, enclosing her in a space where spontaneity itself became dangerous. The court's political climate intensified these pressures. Rivals exploited accusations of impropriety as tools for advancement. Enemies whispered suspicions into the ears of influential men, knowing that the absence of evidence rarely hindered a scandal once it gained momentum. Even those who doubted the rumors hesitated to intervene, fearing association with a cause already marked for condemnation. Women who once stood at the height of favor found themselves surrounded by a silence more threatening than open hostility. Stories of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard persisted not merely because of their tragic endings, but because they illustrated how swiftly admiration could transform into accusation. Both women lived in a world that demanded grace while offering no protection. Their gestures, playful, polity, or politically misread, became grounds for fatal charges. Their trials demonstrated how little truth mattered once suspicion had taken hold. The process unfolded with ritualized precision. A whisper became a rumor became an accusation became a sentence. This climate shaped not only those directly accused but all women who witnessed their downfall. The fear of misinterpretation shaped daily life. A queen kept her distance from male courtiers. A lady-in-waiting avoided speaking too warmly to her own kinsmen. A young bride learned that charm could be misread as impropriety. Humiliation hung over them like a shadow, growing heavier whenever politics became unstable, or the king's temper waned. Men, protected by social norms, rarely consider the injustice of the system. Their reputations survived the scandal with ease. A nobleman caught in an affair might face mild reprimands or brief embarrassment, but his status remained secure. A woman, by contrast, risked everything: her dignity, her security, her life. Each hinged on maintaining a reputation she could not fully control. The imbalance remained unquestioned, upheld by law, custom, and the belief that female virtue required strict containment. Within this unequal world, women cultivated emotional endurance. They adapted to the tension of constant observation, masking fears beneath a surface of calm. Many recognized the hypocrisy embedded in the system, but lacked the power to challenge it. Instead, They survived through caution, forming quiet alliances with other women, sharing knowledge on how to avoid suspicion, and learning to navigate a landscape where innocence offered no protection without the appearance of innocence to accompany it. A wife accused of infidelity discovered how quickly her world could collapse. The household that once relied on her discipline now recoiled. Her husband's anger, whether genuine or politically fueled, determined the pace of her downfall. Her servants withdrew. Her family lost influence, and her voice disappeared into the machinery of accusation. The verdict, once reached, offered no room for redemption. A single misinterpreted glance could end a life built on years of restraint. Within this framework, loyalty flowed in only one direction, demanded fiercely from women while remaining optional for men. A wife lived beneath a gaze that judged her constantly, turning innocence into a fragile shield rather than a guarantee of safety. Those who watched these tragedies unfold understood how easily a single moment could tilt a woman's fate toward ruin without warning. Defiance in a Tudor marriage did not require open rebellion. It could emerge through a quiet disagreement, an unwelcome opinion, or the simple act of hesitating before obeying. Within noble households, even the smallest departure from expected behavior could be interpreted as disobedience, a flaw in the structure that needed correction. Women lived under the expectation that silence was virtue and compliance was duty, and any deviation from this ideal risked consequences delivered not in secrecy but with the full authority of law and custom behind them. A wife who expressed her own thoughts too directly might discover how quickly those around her shifted their tone. A suggestion could be dismissed as insolence, a question framed as disrespect. Men in the household, husbands, stewards, even male relatives, treated their authority as unquestionable, as though the world itself had permitted them to reshape a woman's life. When she resisted, even for her own protection, her refusal served as proof that she required stricter boundaries. Punishment for disobedience was not merely tolerated, it was sanctioned. A husband held legal power to discipline his wife in ways that blurred the line between correction and cruelty. Beatings were justified as moral instruction, confinement as necessary reflection. A woman who spoke too freely might be ordered into isolation, kept in a sparse room or distant wing of the estate until her silence returned. The household accepted this as normal, and servants who sympathized could do little more than offer fleeting glances of pity when passing through corridors. Even the mildest forms of resistance risked escalating consequences. A wife who questioned household decisions, attempted to manage her own property, or expressed displeasure with her husband's behavior could find herself accused of disrupting domestic order. The law regarded her as subordinate, incapable of judgment in matters concerning her own well-being. Once labelled difficult, she carried the stain of defiance everywhere, into meals, gatherings, and private conversations, where her husband's authority was quietly reinforced by those who depended on his favour. The weight of these expectations pressed most heavily on women newly married or young enough to be moulded. They learned early that their safety depended on anticipating displeasure before it surfaced. A slight change in their husband's posture, an abrupt pause in his voice, or a cold glance across the table could signal danger. Many wives adjusted themselves accordingly, softening their tone, lowering their gaze, and suppressing their reactions to avoid drawing attention. Over time, this restraint became instinctive, a constant narrowing of their own personalities until only the acceptable fragments remained. The ideal noblewoman, according to Tudor culture, embodied quiet obedience. She maintained her household, presented herself modestly, and accepted decisions made on her behalf without question. Her virtues were measured not through intelligence or strength of character, but through her ability to appear calm, grateful, and controlled. Even suffering was transformed into a metric of virtue. Endurance signaled loyalty, and silence signaled discipline. A woman who endured mistreatment without protest was praised for her composure, while one who cried out was accused of exaggeration or moral weakness. This atmosphere shaped relationships beyond the marriage itself. Mothers advised daughters to avoid conflict at all costs. Older women who had survived difficult marriages taught younger brides how to soften their responses, when to speak, and how to carry emotional wounds without revealing them. These lessons were passed quietly between generations, forming a lineage of survival strategies built on silence rather than empowerment. The very skills that helped women endure oppression became tools that reinforced the structure containing them. Punishment extended beyond physical and emotional harm. Social consequences carried their own sharp edge. A woman labelled as disobedient risked losing allies within the court or the household. Friends distanced themselves, fearing association with someone viewed as unstable. Relatives hesitated to intervene, uncertain whether defending her would harm their own standing. Isolation served as punishment as effectively as violence, creating an environment where speaking out felt more dangerous than accepting mistreatment. A wife who attempted to protect herself legally found few paths available. The courts supported a husband's authority, citing scripture, custom, and social order. Even when abuse was extreme, officials often viewed it as a private matter, one best resolved within the household. A woman pleading for safety risked being returned to the very man who harmed her, expected to demonstrate renewed obedience as proof of reconciliation. The law's indifference left her with little more than endurance. In this world, a woman's silence became her shield. Though it offered limited protection, she learned to bury her reactions, to let conflicts pass without acknowledgement, and to perform acceptance even when she felt none. Her inner life grew distant from her outward behavior, forming a quiet landscape where fear, resignation, and longing coexisted. Those who looked at her saw composure. Those who knew her privately understood the cost. Disobedience, in truth, could be as simple as remembering she possessed a voice. Within these households, punishment functioned as a reminder that obedience defined a woman's worth more firmly than virtue or loyalty. Her attempts to assert her own judgment dissolved beneath expectations that demanded quiet endurance. In the stillness that followed each reprimand, another boundary tightened, narrowing the space she had left to call her own. Religion in Tudor England did more than shape belief. It shaped behaviour, household order, and the very definition of virtue. A noblewoman lived beneath doctrines that blended faith with obedience, turning her submission into something sacred rather than social. Sermons, confessions, and moral instruction all reinforced a single expectation. A wife must honour and obey her husband as a divine mandate. What began as devotion transformed into structure, pressing her into roles that left little room for personal will. From the moment she married, religious language surrounded her. Clergymen spoke of unity, harmony, and the sanctity of marriage. Yet these teachings carried an unmistakable hierarchy. The husband mirrored authority. The wife reflected obedience. Women were reminded that Eve's failure introduced sin into the world, and the burden of that legacy lingered in every lesson. Scripture was interpreted in ways that emphasized weakness in women and leadership in men, forming a spiritual map that confined her long before she stepped into her household. This teaching was not delivered harshly. It arrived softly, through familiar voices, woven into ceremonies and daily prayers. Yet, its effects were binding. A wife who questioned her husband risked being viewed as challenging divine order itself. Clergy reinforced this connection, insisting that obedience in marriage echoed obedience to God, a woman's virtue. Therefore, it was tested not only through her actions, but through the quiet acceptance of whatever expectations her husband placed upon her. Confession gave these dynamics a sharper edge. In a small, dimly lit space where the priest's voice carried both authority and comfort, a woman was encouraged to reveal her doubts, frustrations, and fears. Yet confession did not exist to protect her. It served to evaluate her. A wife who admitted annoyance with her husband might be counseled to deepen her humility. One who expressed grief over mistreatment might hear that suffering was a path to spiritual refinement. Clergymen, intentionally or not, redirected her emotions inward rather than challenging the systems that caused them. Her private turmoil became framed as a moral failure rather than a response to injustice. This subtle redirection made obedience feel not like a constraint but a responsibility. Even when her husband's demands were unreasonable, she was encouraged to endure them with grace. Her silence became an offering. Her sacrifices a testament to her commitment, and her endurance a measure of spiritual strength. The church rewarded her compliance through praise. Yet the praise reinforced the structure that limited her. Public instruction worked alongside private confession. Sermons often highlighted stories of virtuous wives. Women celebrated for their patience, modesty, and self-denial. These examples shaped expectations within noble households. A wife who deviated from these ideals risked becoming a cautionary tale, whispered among families, or criticized by religious leaders who saw disobedience as moral decay. Entire communities internalized the belief that a woman who challenged her husband jeopardized not only the household, but the spiritual order supporting it. This framework shaped how women interpreted their own emotions. Feelings of resentment were labeled temptations. Desires for independence were framed as dangerous distractions. Moments of frustration were viewed as weaknesses requiring correction. Many women learned to distrust their own instincts, convinced that inner conflict signaled spiritual failing rather than structural oppression. Their faith, sincere and deeply held, became entangled with the expectation that they suppress their doubts for the sake of holiness. Men benefited immeasurably from this arrangement. Their authority gained divine legitimacy, turning personal decisions into spiritual commands. They could insist on obedience without appearing tyrannical, secure in the belief that they were upholding God's will rather than imposing their own desires. Even men who treated their wives harshly could justify their behavior through selective readings of Scripture. The church rarely intervened. Accustomed to viewing domestic life as a realm governed by male leadership, women who sought guidance found themselves directed toward acceptance rather than change. A priest might offer comfort, but comfort came wrapped in reminders of duty. Few avenues existed for challenging unfair treatment, and those who attempted to do so risked being seen as spiritually deficient. Their confessions, instead of providing relief, often deepened their sense of failure. They learned to speak carefully, to reveal only the emotions that would not be used as evidence of rebellion, and to navigate a space meant to protect souls but not bodies. The connection between obedience and salvation created pressure that extended far beyond daily behavior. It shaped how women viewed themselves, blending identity with duty until the two became inseparable. A wife who entertained thoughts of independence found herself wrestling not only with fear of punishment, but with fear of divine disappointment. The weight of faith made the boundaries of her life feel inevitable, even righteous. The brilliance of this system lay in its subtlety. It did not rely solely on force or punishment. It operated through belief. Women upheld the very structures that confined them because they believed obedience ensured spiritual peace. Their devotion, sincere and uncalculated, became a tool that reinforced customs designed without their well-being in mind. In this way, religion did not merely reflect society, it strengthened it, sanctifying expectations that demanded quiet endurance. A noblewoman navigating this world carried faith as both comfort and burden, unsure where devotion ended and submission began. Within this spiritual framework, obedience became a virtue powerful enough to overshadow suffering, binding women to roles shaped long before their lives began. Their confessions eased their conscience while tightening the expectations placed upon them, leaving little room for dissent. Behind each whispered prayer lingered the possibility that even their thoughts could be judged unworthy by those who claimed to speak for God. Widowhood in Tudor England did not open the doors to freedom. It merely shifted the shape of confinement. A noble woman who had spent years living under her husband's authority often discovered that his death did little to loosen the structure surrounding her life. The mourning veil signaled loss, but it also announced a transition into another stage of supervision, one defined not by marriage, but by the interests of the family, the crown, and the society that continued to view her as a resource to be managed rather than an individual with autonomy. Her first days as a widow unfolded under close observation. Servants adjusted their behavior, speaking softly, watching her movements, gauging whether grief made her unpredictable. Advisors and male relatives arrived quickly, ostensibly to offer condolences, but primarily to assess the estate, determine legal responsibilities, and decide how her life would proceed. Even before she regained her footing, others had already begun shaping her future. The household she once managed now belonged to someone else, and every room she entered reminded her that she remained a guest within the structure she helped sustain. The notion that widowhood granted independence was largely an illusion. A woman who attempted to make decisions on her own quickly encountered the boundaries of her authority. Property passed to male heirs, guardianship over children fell to male relatives, financial stability depended on allowances, contracts, and permissions determined long before her grief had begun. Widows were expected to adjust gracefully to these limitations, to embody solemn dignity while relinquishing control over the life they had built. Tudor society viewed widows through a lens shaped by suspicion as much as sympathy. A young widow, especially one without children, was seen as potentially troublesome, too free, too attractive, too capable of forming alliances that might disrupt established plans. Her movements were monitored carefully, her interactions noted, her behavior interpreted through assumptions about female desire and ambition. A conversation with a male guest, an extended visit with a neighbor, or a letter sent without oversight could spark speculation, the fear that she might remarry strategically, bringing wealth or influence into an unintended family, led male relatives to enforce strict boundaries. Remarriage required permission not only from her husband's family, but sometimes from the crown itself. The logic behind this control rested on property, alliance, and political strategy. A wealthy widow possessed assets valuable enough to shape the balance of power among noble houses. If she chose a husband without approval, she risked altering land distribution, shifting loyalties, or strengthening rivals. Thus, her choices were curtailed long before she considered them. Suitors understood that securing her hand depended less on affection and more on navigating the network of approvals that surrounded her. For widows of great wealth, the danger increased. They became targets, figures positioned at the intersection of economic opportunity and social expectation. Men who sought influence viewed marriage to a wealthy widow as a means of ascending rapidly. Families with debts or failing estates hoped to secure her fortune through arranged matches, disguised as offers of stability. Even the crown occasionally intervened, directing widows toward unions that served political interests rather than personal inclination. The widow herself, meanwhile, was expected to accept these arrangements with gratitude, as though being traded between households were a privilege. The emotional cost of this period was often hidden behind ceremonial mourning. Black clothing, lowered voices, and softened steps created an atmosphere that appeared respectful but masked the absence of true support. Among the few who offered genuine comfort were other women who understood the complexity of widowhood, not as a liberating chapter, but as a shift from one form of oversight to another. Their quiet exchanges carried sympathy and caution, shaped by shared awareness that freedom remained limited even after the husband's authority had ended. Isolation compounded these challenges. A widow who showed too much sorrow risked being viewed as unstable. One who recovered too quickly risked being labeled improper. Each expression became a matter of scrutiny. The boundaries around her tightened through unspoken rules, avoid public joy, avoid private company with men, avoid decisions that might appear bold. Even visits to her family of origin could be interpreted as political maneuvers. She learned to move carefully through her own life, adapting to expectations that shifted unpredictably with the opinions of those around her. Financial vulnerability added another layer of control. Allowances varied depending on the goodwill of heirs or administrators. A son might be generous. A brother-in-law might be restrictive. A widow without sons could find herself dependent on distant relatives who viewed her needs as secondary to their own ambitions. Negotiations over income, living arrangements, and household staff became battles fought quietly, often with the widow positioned at a disadvantage despite her former status. Within this system, widowhood became less a period of autonomy and more an extended test of compliance. Her behavior during mourning influenced how others evaluated her worth, her dignity, and her suitability for future arrangements. Any sign of defiance, refusing a proposed match, requesting more financial independence, or seeking greater involvement in her children's upbringing risked being interpreted as ingratitude or rebellion. Yet many widows endured with a resilience that remained unspoken. They cultivated small spaces of privacy within their limited circumstances, preserved meaningful connections discreetly, and navigated the expectations placed upon them with quiet skill. Even so, their strength did not erase the reality of their confinement. Within this world, widowhood offered no escape from the hierarchy that defined a woman's life. Only a shift in the hands that governed her existence. Her grief unfolded beneath layers of supervision shaped by family interest, property, and political caution. Behind the appearance of solemn dignity, weighted choices shaped more by others' ambitions than by her own desires. Escape, for Tudor noblewomen, rarely resembled flight. It emerged through petitions, whispered pleas, and hesitant attempts to loosen the binds of marriage that had tightened steadily over the years. Yet each pathway that seemed to offer relief often led to deeper confinement. The structures surrounding them, law, custom, family loyalty, and political caution, closed in quickly, ensuring that only a few women ever approached the edge of freedom, and fewer still succeeded. For most, the desire to escape became another private burden, spoken only in the quietest corners of their thoughts. One of the most dangerous forms of escape was requesting an annulment. Unlike separation born from mutual agreement, annulment carried the implication that the marriage itself was flawed, offensive, or invalid. This suggestion threatened male authority, family reputation, and the stability of alliances woven through noble households. Thus, a woman who dared to petition for annulment signaled defiance on multiple fronts. Officials treated her request as an inconvenience at best, and an act of rebellion at worst. Once she stepped onto this path, she faced interrogation disguised as concern and moral correction delivered with ceremonial calm. Social consequences followed swiftly. A woman seeking annulment risked losing support from her own family, who feared being associated with scandal. Friends withdrew to protect their standing. Not out of cruelty, but out of caution. The court watched her with new intensity, interpreting her every action as further evidence of instability. Even before a verdict was reached, her reputation began to wither, reshaped by whispers that travelled faster than truth. If the petition failed, which it often did, she returned not to the life she had known, but to a narrower, more controlled existence marked by suspicion. Some women sought escape through the church, believing that the sanctity of religious life might shelter them from marital obligations. Entering a convent, however, required approval from family, clergy, and sometimes the crown. The church did not welcome noble women freely. Their dowries, alliances, and political connections were too valuable to release without careful negotiation. A woman requesting permission to take vows encountered layers of resistance, Some were told their desire reflected emotional weakness. Others were informed that serving God was noble only if it aligned with family interests. Even when permission was granted, it often functioned as exile rather than liberation, placing the woman behind walls intended to silence rather than protect her. Catherine of Aragon embodied the heartbreak of a woman who fought not to escape marriage, but to avoid being cast out of it. Her struggle revealed the cruelty that awaited those who resisted royal demands. She defended her marriage with unshakable conviction, appealing to scripture, conscience, and decades of loyalty. Yet her refusal to submit to the king's wishes resulted not in victory, but in isolation. Removed from court, denied access to her daughter, and restricted in her movements, she endured a solitude shaped by political convenience. Her experience illustrated how resistance, whether aimed at preserving or ending a marriage, often produced the same outcome: confinement enforced by power. Noble women who attempted private acts of escape faced equally harsh consequences. Some tried to flee their estates, seeking refuge with sympathetic relatives. Few succeeded. Travel required resources, servants, and protection, all of which were controlled by men who monitored their movements. A woman discovered on the road without permission risked being returned forcibly, and her attempt would be documented as evidence of instability. Others tried to confide in allies, hoping someone might intervene, but allies feared entanglement in disputes that could jeopardize their own positions. Escape required more than courage. It required networks that women were rarely allowed to build. Even emotional escape, retreat into silence, prayer, or internal distance, carried its own risks. A woman who appeared too withdrawn might be accused of melancholy, a condition viewed with suspicion and treated as a moral failing rather than a reflection of grief. Her inner world offered the only space where she might imagine freedom. Yet even that space was monitored through confession, conversation, or the gaze of those around her. She could not disappear into herself without drawing attention, and attention invited control. The obstacles facing these women were not merely personal, they were structural. A noble woman belonged to her husband, but she also belonged to her family, to political alliances, and to the image of social order that Tudor society worked relentlessly to maintain. Her attempt to escape disrupted the architecture that surrounded her, and the system responded forcefully to preserve itself. Officials, relatives, clergymen, and servants participated, some willingly, others reluctantly, in returning her to the place designated for her. Even when cruelty was visible, the system defended itself at her expense. For the few who did manage to carve out a different fate, the cost was profound. They lost status, home, security, and often the companionship of those they loved. Their victories remained private, fragile, and rarely celebrated. Society preferred to forget them, preserving only the stories that reinforced obedience rather than those that exposed the price of resistance. Escape, then, was not impossible, but it was perilous, lonely, and steeped in consequences that followed a woman long after her attempt ended. Within this world, attempts at freedom revealed how tightly each layer of authority surrounded a woman, closing ranks the moment she tried to step beyond her assigned place. Her choices narrowed the harder she pushed, turning resistance into another doorway leading back toward confinement. In the quiet aftermath of each failed escape, another truth emerged. Freedom was imaginable, but rarely attainable for those born into such bindings. Emotional suffering within Tudor marriages unfolded quietly, concealed beneath routines so familiar that few paused to question them. A noble woman could move through grand halls, oversee servants, host dignitaries, and yet remain profoundly alone. Many lived beside husbands who offered neither affection nor understanding, bound together not by choice but by duty. lineage, and expectation. Their lives appeared orderly from the outside, but within that order lay an emptiness that deepened with each passing year. Love was not expected, but its absence left a noticeable void. A wife who entered marriage hopeful learned quickly that tenderness was optional and often absent. Conversations remained formal, glances avoided depth, and shared moments felt scripted rather than real. She could sit across from her husband at long oak tables, surrounded by silver and candlelight, yet feel as though they inhabited separate worlds. His concerns revolved around politics, property, and reputation. Hers revolved around sustaining a household that rarely acknowledged her humanity. This emotional distance created a silence that settled into every corner of her life. Servants moved quietly, aware that softness was safer than curiosity. Friends became cautious, their visits shaped by unspoken rules. A woman found herself surrounded by people, yet starved of connection, performing roles that demanded grace but offered little comfort. She learned to smile at the appropriate moments, to bow her head with expected humility, and to speak with careful restraint. Over time, these gestures became reflexive, masking the loneliness gathering beneath them. Personal writings, when they survived, revealed truths that daily life concealed. Letters carried fragments of sorrow, phrased delicately to avoid attention. Journals held admissions she dared not speak aloud, long nights marked by restlessness, days shaped by a fatigue that came not from labor but from emotional drought. Some pages described a sense of fading, as though the woman who once existed before marriage had thinned into a shadow of her former self. Others captured flashes of hope that dissolved quickly when confronted by the permanence of expectation. These writings seldom reached sympathetic eyes. Husbands monitored correspondence to maintain control over influence and alliances. Servants delivered letters with a caution that protected their positions more than the woman's privacy. Diaries were hidden in chests, beneath linens, or behind wooden panels, protected not from malice, but from indifference. Emotional expression became a secret act, a quiet rebellion against a world that viewed her feelings as irrelevant to the functioning of the household. Isolation shaped the rhythm of her days. Morning duties, even when performed well, offered no satisfaction. Meals became ceremonies of silence. Evenings brought long hours of contemplation, lit only by candle flame and muted expectation. Her loneliness did not stem from physical separation, but from the absence of acknowledgement. She existed as a figure meant to maintain appearances, not as a partner in thought or emotion. Her presence could be essential to the household, yet unnoticed in its daily life. Conversations with her husband rarely offered relief. When he spoke, he expected agreement, not engagement. When she tried to express concerns, her words were reframed as complaints or misunderstandings. The imbalance between them widened gradually until she felt she had no voice left to offer. Emotional abandonment became indistinguishable from routine, accepted by those around her as a normal part of married life. She bore this quietly, knowing that any attempt to seek comfort elsewhere risked misinterpretation and severe consequences. The physical confinement of marriage magnified the emotional one, unable to travel freely or seek companionship without scrutiny. She had few avenues for connection that did not invite suspicion. Friendships with other women, though meaningful, were monitored. Bonds formed cautiously, built on shared glances and restrained conversations. Even in these relationships, caution lingered. One careless moment could be twisted into evidence of impropriety or rebellion. Within this restricted world, emotional resilience became both a necessity and a burden. Many women taught themselves to detach from their circumstances, creating inner landscapes where they could retreat. These mental spaces offered reprieve, but could not protect them from the weight of expectations that shaped every hour. The dissonance between their internal suffering and external composure deepened the loneliness that surrounded them. The tragedy of their experience lay in how ordinary it appeared. Society recognized physical suffering but dismissed emotional deprivation as trivial. A woman who endured beatings might receive whispered sympathy. One who endured indifference was told to be grateful. Her sadness became invisible, absorbed into the structure that demanded her endurance. Even religious counsel offered little comfort, encouraging patience rather than change. Yet, despite the silence surrounding them, these women left traces of their inner lives. A line in a letter, a passage in a diary, a quiet remark recorded by another. All revealed the depth of their emotional confinement. Their suffering did not erupt dramatically, it accumulated gently, shaping them in ways no one saw but they felt with increasing clarity. Within these marriages, emotional abandonment became a form of harm, as pervasive as any physical confinement, stealing joy while preserving appearances. Her loneliness deepened beneath the rituals of daily life, hidden because silence was easier to accept than her truth. During the hours meant for rest, she carried the weight of a life shaped more by duty than companionship, unsure how much of herself remained untouched by sorrow. Marriage among Tudor nobles did not begin with affection, curiosity, or shared hope. It began with calculations shaped in council chambers and whispered negotiations between families seeking advantage. A daughter's future could be sealed long before she reached maturity, her name appearing on lists of potential alliances that carried the weight of land, diplomacy, and political strategy. She became a piece on a board she had never seen, moved, not according to her wishes, but according to the ambitions of men determined to secure power through union rather than battle. These arrangements unfolded with a formality that concealed their coldness. Letters passed between families framed the proposed match as honorable, beneficial, and agreeable. But beneath the politeness lay a clear objective: to bind two houses tightly enough that neither could move without considering the other. Marriage ended conflicts, secured borders, expanded estates, or strengthened claims to titles. The young woman at the center of these negotiations served as the living seal on agreements, crafted for reasons far removed from her own experience. Her feelings, desires, or fears rarely entered the discussion. Even when she recognized the significance of the match proposed for her, she understood that the decision had already been made. Fathers and uncles met behind closed doors, examining maps, lineage charts, and ledgers that measured the value of her future in terms of influence rather than happiness. She might be informed gently, as though receiving news rather than a command. But the message remained the same. She would marry where she was needed. Her body, her presence, her very existence were woven into strategies that blended family ambition with national politics. As the wedding approached, her role became one of presentation rather than participation. She appeared at feasts, ceremonies, and public gatherings, dressed in garments symbolizing the union of two houses. Her smiles were rehearsed, her gestures softened, her demeanor shaped by women who reminded her that dignity and silence were virtues expected of brides. The political implications of her marriage overshadowed her personal thoughts, leaving her to navigate the transition with composure that belied the uncertainty beneath it. Once married, her role in the alliance deepened. She became the conduit through which trust was exchanged, the figure expected to maintain harmony between two families that might otherwise drift back into rivalry. Her loyalty to her husband's household was monitored closely, and any sign of divided allegiance, whether real or imagined, risked being interpreted as disloyalty. She walked carefully between expectations, aware that her behavior could strengthen or endanger relationships much larger than herself. Her influence in these matters, however, remained symbolic. Though her presence helped solidify alliances, she held no authority in shaping the terms of those agreements. She observed negotiations from a distance, aware that the weight of decisions made in her name rested on her shoulders without granting her a voice. A queen or high-ranking noblewoman might appear central to political life, but even she found her contributions dismissed when they conflicted with the ambitions of men who considered her position a tool rather than a partnership. The emotional cost of existing as an instrument of strategy often went unnoticed. Society praised her composure without acknowledging the sacrifices it demanded. Her marriage might end a war, secure a treaty, or expand territory. Yet she bore the consequences privately. If conflict resurfaced, her loyalty came under suspicion. If the alliance faltered, her worth was questioned. Her identity became entangled with outcomes she could not control, but was expected to influence through grace, obedience, and unwavering commitment. Even within her own household, she felt the pressure of political expectation. Her husband, shaped by similar forces, often viewed her not as a companion, but as a symbol of the alliance. She learned to measure her tone, her steps, her moments of vulnerability, knowing that missteps carried consequences. Her success was determined not by affection, but by how closely she mirrored the ideal set before her. When she fulfilled expectations, the household functioned smoothly. When she faltered, she risked being labelled inadequate or troublesome. In this world, love was not forbidden. It was simply irrelevant. If affection grew, it did so quietly, shaped by proximity rather than choice. If it never arrived, she was expected to endure without complaint. Her emotional life, like her freedom, existed at the margins of a structure designed to prioritize political gain above personal fulfillment. She learned to separate her feelings from her duties, preserving what remained of herself in private moments that seldom belonged entirely to her. Some women found small ways to influence the alliances, forged through their marriages through correspondence, social networks, or the subtle shaping of relationships within the court. Their efforts, however, required caution. Too much influence invited suspicion. Too little invited dismissal. They walked a narrow line, navigating expectations that demanded visible loyalty and invisible suffering. To those outside the system, these marriages appeared grand, strategic, and honorable. To the women within them, they often felt like carefully crafted cages, constructed not from cruelty, but from necessity, upheld by generations who believed that sacrifice was the natural duty of noble daughters. Within these alliances, a woman's marriage served as currency. He exchanged to secure outcomes she would spend a lifetime sustaining without ever receiving acknowledgement. Her feelings remained irrelevant beside the ambitions that shaped her path, leaving little room for a life directed by her own desires. Across the quiet corridors, she walked. Each day lingered the truth that political stability often demanded the silencing of the very woman who embodied it. Queenship in Tudor England appeared magnificent from a distance, with jewels, processions, silks, and ceremonies. But none of these protections extended deep enough to shield a queen from the volatility of the king she married. A queen lived surrounded by courtiers, guarded by attendants, and addressed with reverence. Yet fear threaded itself through each moment of her life. She understood from the beginning that her crown rested not on law, lineage, or merit, but on the shifting affections of a single man whose favor could brighten or darken her world without warning. Every queen entered marriage, aware that admiration could turn swiftly into danger. A gentle remark misinterpreted, a decision made too confidently, or a moment of perceived coldness could provoke suspicion. The king's moods rippled through the court, shaping whispers and alliances, and the queen felt the tremor of these changes before anyone dared speak of them. She might wake to praise and retire to silence. She might offer counsel one day and be dismissed the next. Her life unfolded in rhythms dictated not by her own desires, but by the unpredictable tides of royal temperament. The very visibility of her role intensified the vulnerability beneath it. Every gaze in the court fell upon her, measuring her posture, expression, and relationship to the king, servants, envoys, and ladies-in-waiting observed her closely, not out of hostility, but because her status influenced their own. Any sign of tension between queen and king became a subject of speculation, repeated quietly in hallways, then carried outward into diplomatic conversations. The queen's private emotions became public indicators of political stability, creating pressure that allowed no misstep. Anne of Cleves learned this with brutal clarity, chosen for her political usefulness rather than affection. She arrived in England with the hope of fulfilling the expectations placed upon her. Yet the king, displeased by her appearance, turned cold before the marriage had settled. Her survival depended on a single decision, whether to resist or comply. By agreeing to an annulment, she preserved her life, earning the unusual title of the king's sister and a measure of independence unavailable to most women in her position. But her escape highlighted a chilling truth. Her safety arrived not through her status as queen, but through her willingness to surrender it. Other queens found no such reprieve. A title that seemed magnificent in the ceremony offered no defense when accusations surfaced. They faced scrutiny fueled by politics, jealousy, or the king's personal frustrations. A queen could be adored one year and executed the next. Her rise and fall transformed into spectacles that reinforced royal authority. Even those who posed no threat risked being discarded when the king sought novelty, alliance, or an heir their bodies could not produce. Queenship, in essence, meant standing at the centre of power while possessing almost none of it. The daily life of a queen reflected this tension. She moved through rooms, accompanied by attendants selected not for her comfort, but for their loyalty to the king. Conversations were monitored, correspondence read, and friendships evaluated for political implications. Her inner world contracted under these conditions. Shaped by caution rather than companionship, she learned to guard her words, her gestures, and even her silences, knowing that any of them could be interpreted as evidence of hidden ambition or discontent. Fear did not always manifest dramatically. Often it appeared as a quiet, constant presence. A queen might eat delicately while feeling the weight of unspoken expectations. She might walk through galleries lined with portraits of earlier monarchs and wonder how future generations would remember her, if they remembered her at all. She might lie awake at night, listening to footsteps echo through the palace, uncertain whether news carried toward her door signaled praise, suspicion, or condemnation. The crown's grandeur deepened the isolation. People admired her, but few approached her with honesty. Courtiers performed loyalty while calculating advantage. Ladies-in-waiting offered comfort while mindful of political wins. Even family connections became tenuous once she entered the royal household. For relatives who sought favour risked displeasing the king and jeopardizing her already fragile position. She stood at the centre of a court that revolved around her presence, yet rarely recognized her humanity. Queenship demanded a strength seldom acknowledged. It required endurance in the face of unpredictability, composure under scrutiny, and acceptance of a life where affection could not be relied upon. Many queens carried themselves with dignity, despite profound loneliness. They fulfilled ceremonial roles, encouraged diplomacy, and supported charitable work. Yet none of these acts could protect them when the king's attention shifted elsewhere. What made their vulnerability most striking was how thoroughly it contradicted public perception. Subjects believed the queen was untouchable, elevated above the reach of ordinary fear. But behind palace doors, she lived with the knowledge that her life depended on forces she could neither command nor predict. The grandeur surrounding her only sharpened the contrast between appearance and reality. Queenship in Tudor England was not a sanctuary. It was a threshold between influence and peril. illuminated brightly, yet shadowed by danger at every turn. Across this landscape, a queen discovered that her crown offered spectacle rather than security, leaving her exposed to judgments shaped far beyond her control. Her fate shifted with the king's changing affections, deepening the fragility that neither ceremony nor title could conceal. During the quiet hours before dawn, she understood that even the highest seat in the realm rested on ground that could crumble beneath her without warning. Silence became one of the few forms of protection available to a Tudor wife. A fragile shield, but a shield nonetheless. She learned early that words could turn dangerous once they left her lips, that truth spoken aloud could be twisted by listeners, and that even justified anger might be remembered as rebellion. So she shaped her survival around quiet endurance, letting her expression harden into something unreadable each time disappointment passed through her life. Her silence was not surrender. It was a strategy. Many women discovered this necessity the moment betrayal entered their marriage. A husband might flaunt his mistress openly, offer gifts to another woman, or spend nights away from home without explanation. Confrontation would only expose the wife to further humiliation or retaliation. So she mastered the art of smiling through the wound. It was not because she felt nothing, but because feeling too visibly could be used against her. A calm face allowed her to continue moving through the world, even when her heart felt stripped bare. Diplomacy became another tool for survival. One, refined quietly behind closed doors, a wife in a powerful household had to navigate factions, feuds, and shifting alliances that curled through every corridor. Some women excelled at this, shaping their responses with precision. They offered kindness without appearing weak, maintained neutrality without seeming indifferent, and gave praise sparingly so it could not be mistaken for manipulation. Their silence was a way of listening to moods, to rumors, to subtle signals that warned of trouble long before it arrived. Within the court, silence functioned as a kind of language. It allowed a woman to conceal her thoughts in a place where thoughts were constantly examined. She could sit through conversations filled with insinuations and not reveal whether she recognized the threat. She could watch rivalries unfold without stepping into their path. Silence also softened her presence, making her appear harmless to those who sought targets. To survive court life was to understand that danger often came disguised as opportunity, and that speaking too quickly could pull her into currents she could not control. For some women, the pressure became too heavy to bear, and withdrawal offered the only relief. A quiet estate in the countryside promised distance from scrutiny. Fields, stone walls, and open air replaced courtly suspicion. Servants spoke plainly. Visitors arrived without hidden motives, and life settled into predictable rhythms. It was not freedom in the modern sense, but it granted a kind of gentleness absent in the political center of the realm. The silence there was not a weapon, it was a balm. Others found refuge in religious houses, where the world narrowed to prayer, to routine, and anonymity. A convent offered a woman a life without marriage, without courtship, and without the expectation of heirs. Within its walls, her past held less power. She became one voice among many, no longer examined through the lens of her family, her husband, or her fertility. The silence of the cloister was different from the silence of marriage. It did not require fear, only discipline. For women wounded by years of scrutiny, that difference mattered deeply, yet silence carried its own ache. A woman who learned to endure quietly often felt her inner life fade under the weight of unspoken thoughts. She accepted indignities because speaking them aloud risked everything she possessed. Her home, her status, her safety. Journals sometimes reveal how heavy this silence became. She wrote carefully, describing a life filled with formalities, but stripped of tenderness. She described evenings spent beside a husband who did not see her, days shaped by obligations she could not refuse, nights weighed down by questions she dared not voice. Despite this, silence allowed her to survive. In a culture that granted her little protection, it offered a narrow path through danger. She could study the people around her, anticipating their intentions. She could maintain dignity even when circumstances tried to break her. She could protect her children by avoiding conflicts that might place them at risk. Quietness gave her time, space, and the possibility of choosing her steps rather than being pushed into them. Some women used silence to build subtle forms of influence. They observed what others missed, remembered details others ignored, and chose their interventions with precision. A soft remark delivered at the right moment could redirect an argument. A calm expression could unsettle a rival more effectively than sharp words. Though the world saw silence as weakness, some women transformed it into a quiet mastery of their surroundings. Still, not all emerged unscathed. There were women whose silence sealed their suffering rather than easing it. They faded inside marriages that neither valued nor understood them. They moved through rooms like shadows, performing their duties without expectation of comfort. Their stories remind us that silence was not always chosen. It was sometimes forced, pressed into them by systems that offered no alternatives. The truth of Tudor marriage lies somewhere between endurance and disappearance. A woman's silence could preserve her life, but it could also erase her. The challenge was to balance survival with selfhood, to hold on to something private and unbroken, even as the world demanded compliance. Silence became the only shield they could rely on, a quiet armor that hid both fear and calculation beneath steady breaths. Some learned to survive by offering soft smiles that concealed bruised pride, while others slipped away into distant corners where their absence raised no questions. There were also whispers about daughters watching these choices, absorbing every gesture, and preparing themselves for the same unbroken cycle. They entered the world already, carrying expectations shaped long before their first breath, growing beneath roofs where every gesture, every word, and every silence taught them who they were allowed to be. Their days unfolded quietly, filled with lessons too subtle to challenge, yet too heavy to escape. Mothers watched their daughters with a mixture of tenderness and resignation, knowing that what they passed down was not freedom, but endurance. The walls of these homes held generations of unspoken rules, and the girls absorbed them long before they could understand what obedience truly cost. From early childhood, they were guided through carefully curated routines meant to mold them into the kind of women who would not disrupt the order imposed upon them. There were no lessons in questioning, only in accepting. Dresses were tightened, not simply to shape their bodies, but to remind them of boundaries. Conversations at the table taught them where their voices should rise and where they must fall. A gentle nod, a controlled smile, a lowered gaze. Each became a tool for survival. They learned that approval was earned through quiet compliance, not through desire or self-assertion. Mothers did not speak of escape. Such a thought would have seemed reckless in a world built on fragile alliances and unforgiving expectations. Instead, they taught their daughters the art of patience, how to swallow disappointment without letting it settle on their faces, how to soften their tone even when silence felt suffocating, how to appear composed when their hearts trembled beneath the surface. The daughters watched and mimicked, believing this was simply how life unfolded for women of their standing. They learned to endure before they learned to hope. Even playtime carried the weight of instruction. Wooden dolls were dressed as brides, not explorers. Stories emphasized duty, sacrifice, and honor, never the thrill of choices made freely. Every tale reinforced the same quiet message. Their lives were not their own to shape. As they grew older, the lessons sharpened. They were expected to move with grace, never haste, to speak with calm, never conviction. Their childhood was less a beginning and more an early rehearsal for the confinement that awaited them. Within the household, subtle comparisons were made to older sisters, aunts, or grandmothers. women who had upheld their duties without complaint. Praise was offered for restraint, not confidence. A girl who asked too many questions was gently corrected, then gradually dismissed until she learned to quiet herself. Curiosity was tolerated only when it did not disturb the harmony that others depended upon. Innocent mischief, once charming in boys, became evidence of unacceptable boldness in girls. These differences shaped them long before they realized how profoundly gender divided their futures. The daughters watched their mothers navigate marriages marked by distance or obedience, absorbing every strained smile and forced cordiality. They saw how their mother's strength hid beneath composed expressions, how their voices softened when authority entered the room, how exhaustion lingered behind their eyes even when their posture remained upright. Without intending to, mothers became mirrors of the constraints shaping them. Daughters did not need to be told what awaited them. They already understood that marriage was less a choice and more a passage into another form of quiet captivity. By adolescence, any spark of rebellion had been gently pressed into something manageable. They learned the dangers of appearing too willful, too clever, too alive. Suitors valued pliability, not personality. Families sought alliances, not personal happiness. The girls became symbols long before they became brides, tokens to be exchanged for land, security, or influence. Their worth was measured in silence, not expression, in obedience, is not ambition. They understood that their lives would move along predetermined paths carved generations before them. A girl raised in such a household often found herself standing between expectation and longing, aware of desires she could never voice. She might gaze out a window and imagine a life shaped by choices. Yet she knew that each step she took would be monitored, each decision filtered through the needs of her family. Her dreams were allowed only in the quiet hours, when the world slept, and no one required her to perform the role prepared for her. Even then, she kept those dreams small, afraid that wanting too much would only deepen her disappointment. Over time, the cycle hardened around them. What mothers taught was not weakness, but survival, a way to endure a life that offered little room for resistance. They believed that protecting their daughters meant preparing them for a world that punished disobedience harshly. In this sense, love became intertwined with constraint. By passing down the quiet skills of endurance, they ensured their daughters lived long enough to raise daughters of their own, continuing the pattern etched into their lineage. The daughters grew into young women expected to sacrifice individuality for the sake of stability. Their futures were shaped by signatures not their own, arranged around alliances forged in rooms they would never enter. When the day came for them to leave their childhood homes, they stepped into marriages built on obligations rather than affection, carrying with them lessons that promised safety only through silence. The weight of inheritance was not land or wealth, but the quiet acceptance of lives bounded by others. Within these homes, girlhood unfolded as the earliest stage of surrender, a quiet preparation for the limits waiting beyond the threshold. Each generation repeated the same lessons, reinforcing endurance as both virtue and necessity. There was always a moment when a daughter realized she had become exactly what her mother once was, and that recognition carried its own quiet ache. Quiet corners of Tudor households held the earliest traces of resistance, shaped not by shouts or defiance, but by gestures so restrained they almost disappeared into the rhythm of daily life. Women learned to bend their suffering into forms that would not draw punishment, channeling frustration into subtle creativity, shaping endurance into expression. No grand rebellions marked their paths, only careful steps, deliberate choices, and a determination to remain inwardly intact even when outward obedience was required. What the world mistook for silence often concealed a steady current of intention. Some discovered freedom through writing, trusting ink to carry thoughts that could never safely pass their lips. Letters to trusted confidants slipped quietly across thresholds, dressed in polite language yet laced with coded meaning. A repeated metaphor, a softened lament, a carefully placed image. These turned simple correspondence into a private landscape where their unspoken truths could breathe. Hidden notebooks held verses that captured confinement with an honesty too dangerous for public ears. Writing did not rescue them, but it granted a dim, fragile light in rooms otherwise shadowed by duty. Others reached instinctively toward art. Knowing its beauty invited admiration rather than suspicion. Patronage became a form of influence, allowing them to suggest themes through the works they supported. A portrait that emphasized introspection rather than obedience. A commissioned piece that lingered on longing or resilience. These quiet choices threaded their perspective into a world dominated by male narratives. Even the way they posed for their own portraits became an act of resistance. A subtle angle of the chin, a book held deliberately, a gaze steadier than expected. Clothing became another discreet language. Colors, patterns, and embroidered symbols carried private meaning. Hidden beneath the formality expected of noble women. A single stitch of indigo might honor a friend enduring hardship. A repeated floral motif could signal loyalty to someone forbidden. A muted pattern placed near the wrist might express grief that could not be voiced. Outsiders saw only beauty. Those who understood saw the intention. In a life where speech was controlled, fabric became a canvas for truths too fragile to speak aloud. Many women resisted through generosity, a form of strength often dismissed but quietly transformative. Acts of kindness carried further than authority expected, a whispered warning, a discreet recommendation, a moment of shelter offered to someone overlooked. By nurturing bonds with servants, cousines, or visiting companions, they created networks of support strong enough to alter destinies in small but meaningful ways. Influence traveled through gentle acts, shaping outcomes without ever declaring its presence. Some found refuge in relationships built beneath the surface of courtly order. Friendships among women allowed information to travel where official channels could not. They passed warnings, eased burdens, and shared small victories behind closed doors. These connections formed a hidden architecture beneath the rigid hierarchy. An architecture delicate, easily broken, yet essential for survival. A single conversation held in a quiet chamber could protect a woman from disgrace or guide her through the shifting favoritism of the court. Resistance also emerged in stillness. A composed expression when confronted with insult. A deliberate pause before obeying a command. A steady posture in the face of intimidation. These small acts quietly undermined expectations. They learned that restraint could unsettle those accustomed to their compliance. Their silence was not surrender. It was a strategy, shaped by an understanding that visible rebellion would destroy them long before it changed anything. Yet, every covert act invited risk. A letter could fall into the wrong hands. A symbolic thread in a gown could be misinterpreted. A supportive alliance could crumble under pressure from those who controlled their fates. Still, the danger did not extinguish their efforts. It refined them. Their resistance grew quieter, smaller, more precise, becoming a discipline rather than an impulse. What remained steady was their refusal to let confinement erode their inner selves completely. Over the years, these subtle acts accumulated into something deeper. A poem passed hand to hand outlived its writer. A portrait influenced descendants who studied its unusual composition. A gesture of support changed the course of another woman's life, granting her the strength she carried forward. Their impact rarely appeared in records, yet it lingered in softened traditions, unexpected alliances, and a slow, almost imperceptible shift in how women understood themselves. This was not a rebellion in the dramatic sense. It was endurance sharpened into intention, expressed through quiet persistence. These women carried their resistance like a hidden ember, small, steady, capable of surviving winds that would extinguish anything brighter. Their influence lay not in altering the world at once, but in refusing to disappear within it. Every restrained gesture carved a narrow refuge where their identities could endure despite the weight placed upon them. Subtle actions allowed meaning to travel beneath watchful eyes, shaping lives more gently, but no less powerfully. In quiet corners of their world, a single symbol or whispered line often hinted at courage far greater than anyone dared to name. Across generations, the weight of Tudor law lingered like a shadow that refused to loosen its grip, shaping womanhood long after the original statutes had faded from legal texts. What began as rigid expectations within noble households hardened into a cultural memory that outlived the people who first suffered under it. Later daughters, granddaughters, and even distant descendants inherited these expectations without fully understanding their origins. All they knew was that obedience had been carved into the role of woman so deeply that challenging it felt like resisting the natural order, rather than resisting injustice. The force of the past did not vanish. It settled quietly into the bones of society. Stories of Tudor women rarely travelled forward as celebrations of strength or individuality. Instead, they were preserved as cautionary lessons, warnings delivered in hushed tones, meant to encourage compliance rather than courage. A girl might hear about an ancestor who defied her husband and paid dearly for it. The tale was shaped not to honour the woman's bravery, but to discourage similar behaviour. Another name might appear in a family lineage only as a footnote, mentioned briefly before elders moved the conversation elsewhere. Through repeated retellings, these stories lost their emotional truth and became tools for preserving conformity. Even within historical records, the presence of these women felt strangely hollow. Their names were often reduced to marital connections or titles that revealed nothing of their inner lives. They appeared as appendages to powerful men, introduced only in relation to husbands, fathers, or sons. Their individuality disappeared into the margins, their quiet rebellions erased in favour of accounts that upheld order. When their voices surfaced in letters or fragmentary writings, the documents were tucked away in archives, acknowledged but rarely given prominence. The erasure was not always intentional. Sometimes it was the natural result of a world uninterested in what women endured. The legal structure that once dictated their existence eventually dissolved, but its influence survived in subtler ways. Expectations regarding obedience, modesty, and self-restraint persisted. Transmitted not by law, but by custom, families continued to expect daughters to behave with quiet dignity, to speak carefully, to avoid drawing attention. These lingering expectations shaped marriages, social interactions, and even private thoughts. Women internalized the belief that their worth was tied to compliance, that their desires were secondary, and that sacrifice was simply part of their nature. The silence that Tudor law once demanded evolved into the silence that women imposed upon themselves. In many households, mothers passed down the lessons their own mothers had learned under stricter systems. The advice sounded gentle, almost protective. Avoid trouble. Keep peace. Be patient. Yet beneath these soft words lay the echo of older restrictions. Warnings carried forward from a past where disobedience could cost a woman her safety, her dignity, or her life. Daughters followed these guidelines because the consequences of ignoring them remained unclear but ominous. They sensed the shape of old dangers even without seeing their boundaries. Historical narratives reinforced this pattern. Scholars praised the accomplishments of kings, generals, and statesmen, while women's experiences were relegated to footnotes. When women did appear, it was often as symbols, tragedies, moral lessons, or nameless examples of suffering. Their emotions, thoughts, and choices were rarely explored, with the same depth granted to their male counterparts. Even when historians attempted to recover their stories, they encountered gaps so wide that the women seemed to have slipped between the cracks of time itself. The silence became part of their legacy, Some women's names vanished entirely. Their lives left no trace except through descendants who felt their absence without understanding it. These erased women had endured years of constraint, contributed to family legacies, and shaped the emotional landscapes of their homes. Yet history allowed them to dissolve into anonymity. The quiet persistence of their suffering became a hidden inheritance, a pattern repeated rather than remembered. Their absence served as a reminder of how easily a life could be lived fully, yet recorded barely at all. The legacy of legal oppression extended beyond the noble class. Ideas about obedience filtered into the broader culture, shaping the expectations placed on women from all walks of life. The belief that a woman's role was to endure, to adapt, and to remain outwardly composed became an unspoken standard. Even when women pushed against these boundaries, they often did so quietly, aware that open defiance still carried social penalties. Tudor law had laid the foundation for a structure that persisted long after its stones were removed. Over centuries, small shifts began to appear, moments when women reclaimed fragments of the history that had forgotten them. A discovered letter, a surviving poem, a carefully preserved portrait offered glimpses of their inner worlds. Modern readers might feel the urgency within these fragments, the subtle defiance or quiet grief. These documents did not overturn the past, but they revealed how much had been hidden beneath it. The more historians looked, the clearer it became that women had always contributed far more than records acknowledged. Yet, even with these discoveries, the larger legacy remained, a world shaped by silence, by compliance, and by generations taught to accept limits imposed long ago. The endurance of these patterns proved how deeply Tudor expectations had rooted themselves in cultural consciousness. The laws no longer existed, but their shadow remained, reminding women of boundaries once carved into their lives with brutal clarity. The memory of those legal constraints lingered in customs that survived long after the statutes were gone, shaping identities quietly but persistently. Even fragments of their stories reveal how thoroughly their voices were softened or erased, turned into warnings rather than acknowledgements of strength. Across the fading traces of their names, a question remains: what might their world have become had their voices been allowed to endure? Gilded titles offered little protection to the women who carried them, their lives shaped more by expectation than privilege. Every step they took within the grand halls of Tudor palaces echoed with the reminder that admiration did not equal freedom. They were surrounded by wealth, ceremony, and attendants trained to fulfill their needs. Yet all of it existed to maintain an image rather than to nurture their inner lives. A queen, a duchess, a noble consort, each bore the weight of a role carved long before she was born. A role that demanded perfection while denying her the right to choose her own happiness. The splendor surrounding them became another form of restraint, a beautiful facade built to hide the quiet ache of confinement. Long corridors shimmered under the glow of carefully polished brass. But their beauty did not soften the isolation felt by the women who walked them. Draped in silk and velvet, they moved with practiced grace, their expressions shaped by lessons learned since childhood. Servants bowed as they passed, addressing them with reverence. Yet none of this reverence offered a genuine connection. Their every word was weighed, every movement observed, every silence interpreted by those eager to guess their favor or disfavor. The palace became a living organism that breathed around them, watching without rest. Though surrounded by people, many noble women lived with an unbroken sense of solitude. The constraints they faced differed from those of common women only in form, not in essence. While wealthy, they remained bound by expectations of obedience, loyalty, and composure. They could not speak openly about fear or longing. They could not choose whom to trust. Even friendships required caution, for alliances at court shifted as quickly as the winds outside the palace gates. Favor from the king or queen could vanish without warning. pulling these women into the turbulence of political games they never sought to play. Their days unfolded within a structure that demanded their presence while ignoring their desires. The clothing that adorned them, layer upon layer of embroidery, jewels, and carefully tailored fabric, created the illusion of strength. Yet each garment also restricted their movement. Stiff bodices straightened their posture but limited their breath. Heavy skirts swayed elegantly but slowed their steps. These burdens were presented as symbols of status, yet they mirrored the deeper constraints woven into their lives. Underneath the grandeur, many women carried a quiet longing for something simpler, the freedom to choose one's path, to speak without fear, to live without performing a role scripted by others. Within the palace walls, danger often arrived quietly. A whisper, a rumor, a passing glance was misinterpreted. These small moments carried heavy consequences. The fate of a noblewoman could shift on the smallest spark of suspicion. A supposed betrayal, a questioned loyalty, or a perceived slight could place her at risk of disgrace. Or worse, history recorded the dramatic ends of queens and consorts who fell from favour, but it rarely captured the constant tension felt by those who managed to survive. Every victory was fragile, every misstep unforgiving. Anne Boleyn's downfall still haunted the women who followed her, a stark reminder that neither intelligence, nor charm, nor beauty offered protection. Catherine Howard's youthful misjudgments demonstrated how innocence could be weaponized against a woman too young to understand the dangers surrounding her. Even those who escaped severe punishment did so by treading carefully, learning to read shifting expressions, to sense hidden threats, and to silence their own frustration. They learned to swallow truth for the sake of survival. The cold stone of Tudor corridors amplified their quiet footsteps, each echo a reminder of how little control they held. Their voices rarely travelled far in these spaces, swallowed by the very architecture meant to elevate the power of the monarchy. Advice offered by queens often went ignored. Warnings whispered by noblewomen were dismissed. Their influence, when acknowledged, was credited to the men around them rather than to their own insight. Even their grief, their rage, and their devotion were framed only as reflections of their husbands' legacies. Yet the women themselves endured with a quiet steadiness that history seldom honoured. They managed the emotional landscape of their households, kept peace among volatile alliances, and navigated the delicate balance between visibility and invisibility. They learned to steady trembling hands beneath folded sleeves, to speak without revealing fear, to maintain calm while their futures hung in uncertainty. Their resilience existed not in monumental acts, but in the quiet ability to continue each day under impossible pressures. As they aged, some found traces of freedom through subtle withdrawals. A queen might retreat into her private chambers, surrounding herself with trusted attendants. A duchess might claim time for prayer, using devotion as a shield against unwanted demands. A noblewoman might tend to charitable works, carving out a space where she could exercise agency, however limited. These acts did not dismantle the cage, but they softened its edges, offering brief breaths of autonomy in lives otherwise defined by duty. The records of these women remain fragmented, scattered across letters, portraits, and second-hand accounts. Much of what they endured went unspoken, written only in pauses between lines or in the restrained expressions captured by portrait painters. Their silence was rarely a choice. It was an inheritance. These women were taught to preserve dignity by concealing pain, to protect themselves by revealing nothing. History, shaped by louder voices, misinterpreted this silence as emptiness, but beneath it lived stories of endurance, longing, compassion, and quiet resistance. In the end, the golden cage that surrounded them glittered under torchlight as if proud of its beauty. Guests marvelled at the richness of court life, unaware of the cost borne by the women whose lives were displayed like ornaments. Titles impressed the world, but titles did not soften loneliness. Wealth commanded admiration, but wealth did not shield a woman's heart. The palace stood as a symbol of power. Yet for many noble women, it was a place where their most intimate truths dissolved into the cold air of corridors that never cared to listen. Every chamber, no matter how lavish, carried the same unspoken truth. Dignity could not erase confinement, and splendor could not soften the weight of expectation. Behind each embroidered sleeve and jeweled collar lived a heart taught to endure far more than it was allowed to name. Somewhere within those quiet halls lingered a question that outlasted them all. What might their lives have been if the world had ever stopped to hear them? Good night, and may your thoughts drift gently as you leave these quiet Tudor halls behind. May you rest, knowing that even the softest stories carry strength, and may sleep come to you like a kind hand lifting the weight from your shoulders. Let the night wrap around you with calm, and may your dreams be gentler than the lives of the women we have walked beside.